Hi, I'm Ellen Halliday, Deputy Editor of Prospect. You're about to watch the interview portion of the latest episode of the Prospect podcast with this week's special guest. For the full episode with additional discussion from Prospect Senior Editor Alona Ferber and myself, click the link in the description below to listen via your favourite podcast app. And if you'd like to read more of Prospect's award-winning journalism, visit prospectmagazine.co.uk.
Rachel, it's wonderful to have you here on the podcast. Thanks so much for joining us. I want to start by asking you about the title of your book, which is, I think, just the perfect title for this topic, Off-White. Can you explain that for our listeners? Why did you choose that title?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on, first of all. And it is a title. It's a title that came up through speaking with a lot of Jewish people, both in the UK but also beyond, in the US as well, about this whole idea of, are Jewish people white? Are they not white? Have we been absorbed into whiteness but not quite? And so it speaks to that contingency that a lot of Jewish people do still feel, whereby yes, we can say that Jewish people who show up as white are, in some way getting the benefits of whiteness and have been absorbed into that system, certainly post the World War era. But it's like, we're white, but we're not really white. We're not white. So we're off-white. And that's how I arrived at that point, because I do think a lot of Jewish people I spoke with really struggled with that, in the sense that the Jewish people who show up as white do know they're white, right? They have looked in the mirror, but it's not quite that straightforward for a population that has been racialized as not white for longer than it has been absorbed into whiteness.
You obviously, you're a Jewish woman. You have Iraqi Jewish heritage. How much you talk about this a bit in the book? Can you explain for our listeners how much this sort of, to what extent did your personal story frame your thinking about off-whiteness and anti-Semitism?
It inevitably is part of the story in a book that looks so much about identity for people who are showing up as a racialized minority. And I will say, I was born in Israel. My parents are Iraqi. I was raised in the UK. And growing up in the UK during the 70s and 80s was not straightforward for someone with that many hyphens in their name or their identity, because people didn't quite know what to make of us. It's like, wait, you're Israeli, but you're Iraqi. You're Jewish, but you speak Arabic. We don't really know what's going on. So there was always a sort of category error around that sort of hyphenated identity. And that comes into the book ongoingly, in the sense that, much like my first book, which is about how Jews from Arab and Muslim lands got absorbed into a country, Israel, that basically whitewashed them and de-Arabized them because it wanted to be European. And so a lot of this book is about bringing Middle Eastern Jews back into the frame, because I think that does very much affect the way we talk about this, the way we talk about whiteness, but also the way we talk about Israel-Palestine, which is such a big part of this story, of course.
Yeah, completely. I think we're going to come back a bit to some of those questions that you've raised there, but you also mentioned kind of the challenges in the UK for many Jewish people, and where their identity kind of fits within wider British society. Near the start of your book, you cite a historian who describes Britain as the first and the worst in terms of sort of history of anti-Semitism.
I think it's a really important question that you just asked, because it speaks to the idea that anti-Semitism is a force that, much like other racisms, runs deep in British society. And I think to a large extent that is unacknowledged, as it is with other kinds of racism. In general, I think we are quite low information in our understanding of how much the UK itself was part of the origin story and the upholding of so many of these kinds of racism. And whereas perhaps we're starting, and we're all on this journey of understanding the UK's role when it comes to enslavement of people and colonialism and empire, I think the bit that quite often gets dropped off that is the bit that says, okay, Britain, you literally invented the blood libel, right? You were, according to historians of medieval history, the first country, but also part of a European collective that long before anyone talked about races of people, you absolutely were racist towards Jewish people. You othered them. Of course, the Christian church, which, in those days had state power, and therefore its impact was structural and systemic, for hundreds and hundreds of years was basically persecuting and demonizing Jewish people as supposed Christ killers. And Jewish people were set up as the sort of punch bag in societies where they were elevated, given just enough status so that they could be used to deflect criticism when it was directed at ruling powers. And you can see incidents of that throughout both British history, but actually more widely across Europe.
That kind of demonization, racism towards Jewish people is perhaps less obvious in some ways now, compared to those kind of, the creation of these prejudices towards Jewish people that you talk about in sort of medieval period. Why do you think that, or how do you think that origin being the first and the worst, how do you think that's changed up until today?
It's a really complicated story, because we can see, if you look at the history of anti-Semitism across Europe, well, the first thing that comes up really obviously is how interconnected it is with other kinds of racism, that they actually influence and cross-pollinate from each other. And so the sort of racism that was directed towards Jewish people, say, in Spain, following the Catholic reconquest of Spain, of the Al-Andalus region, which up until then had been under Muslim rule. So this was 1492. The sort of purity of blood rule that you can see Spanish rulers apply to Jewish people and later Muslim people then travels across the Americas with the conquest of the Americas and the enslavement of people there. And then it, travels across and informs the one-drop rule that was used to uphold white supremacy, essentially, in America. And so you can see this sort of bouncing back and forth between racism and anti-Semitism. Then you see a change, and it's most pronounced in the US, and it's most pronounced in the post-war period. So after the Holocaust, there was this process by which Jewish people were far more overtly ushered into Western societies. And it was as much about those Western countries rehabilitating their own image, i.e., we are the post-Holocaust West. We are not the pre-Holocaust West that did the Holocaust or ignored it or didn't let Jewish refugees arrive, for instance, in the US or the UK at the most critical moments when they were trying to escape the Third Reich. So as a way of drawing a line between those pre-Holocaust Western societies and post-Holocaust ones, Jewish people were by and large absorbed into Western whiteness and afforded privileges that would allow a swift integration. And so in that post-World War era, we do see Jewish people across Western societies show up in a way that, is pretty well integrated, pretty much absorbed, pretty much a success story. However, because anti-Semitism is such a deep sort of well across these societies, it very quickly rises to the surface in moments of crisis. And the other thing is that it's not, of course, true that Jewish people are universally doing okay or doing well. There was a survey in 2023 across the UK that looked at racial equality, and it found that actually people categorized as white, i.e. white Jewish people and Gypsy Roma traveler communities, were amongst some of the most discriminated against when it came to not just physical and verbal abuse, but also state discrimination in things like housing and jobs. So it's a complicated picture even today, but it absolutely is not the sort of widespread state-sponsored structural discrimination, systemic discrimination that we see for Black and brown people in this country.
What do you think people misunderstand the most about anti-Semitism?
Well, the thing that I hear most often, people in moments of honesty will say to me, well, I just don't understand how Jewish people, how there can be racism against Jewish people. I just don't see that they're an oppressed group. Okay. And it's like, well, the first thing is, as we just said, that's not true. There are ways in which Jewish people are discriminated against in a straightforward way that would chime with our understanding of racism, particularly Jewish people who show up who are visibly not white or are visibly Jewish. But the other thing is that I think people fundamentally misunderstand that anti-Semitism is basically a conspiracy about power, right? It's not Jewish people are inferior and, negatively stereotyped, although that can happen and historically has happened. It's primarily Jewish people are powerful, wealthy, fifth columnists who are plotting to destroy societies from within. That's the conspiracy. That's the conspiracy of power. And that's how it keeps showing up across societies. And that's how actually you can see in moments of crisis, or particularly across the Israel-Palestine conflict, where it does show up, it does have strains of anti-Semitism. It is around conspiracies of power. And I think that's the bit that most often I've seen people struggle to understand, because it doesn't fit in with our appraisal of racism that is premised on a black-white binary. And of course, we need that black-white binary. We need it to understand structural racism, but it only gets us so far. And it certainly doesn't get us very far when it comes to understanding anti-Semitism.
One of the things that I thought was really so interesting in your book is this kind of hidden history of, well, not a hidden history, but there's a certain amount of, you alluded to it just now, of kind of othering and physical stereotyping of Jews in the past, that they smell bad, they look strange, that kind of maps onto, or that kind of chimes much more with our kind of understandings of racism, right? Like, actually, it's about power, but also Jews were othered in a way that just sounds very racist in the way that we understand racism at various points in history, right? It's not always been a completely different kind of othering.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And it's such an interesting point when you look at the history, right throughout up to and including the whole sort of scientific racism, in inverted commas, which was just nonsense. It tried not very successfully to rationalize racism, but you could see, because it's so irrational and defies any kind of logic, clearly. But you could see such obvious parallels. You could see Jewish people being described in much the same way that Black people would be described by racists, by people who thought that they were being very scientific and logical, but were just straight up racists. And so, yeah, you see these same categories of like woolly hair, bad smell, something about the nose, animal-like features, animal-like behaviors, overtly sexualized, all the same themes. And you also see the thing that history shows us, I think, is not just that Jewish people present the configuration is contested and ambivalent when it comes to white or not white, but actually that whole category is nonsense. The whole category is fake. And we see that when we look at the era of so-called scientific racism, because they actually didn't know what to do with Jewish people who showed up as white. They were like, but wait, you're Black. So because we don't like you and we're going to other you. So it must be because you have Black blood, or it must be because, you have so-called Black features. And so they try and come up with these ways of making white presenting Jewish people racialize them. And so again and again and again, what this history shows us is that the categories are nonsense, is that whiteness is a fiction invented by Christian Europeans to persecute and demonize different categories of people in different ways. But it was always Christian Europeans doing it. And I think that's another reason why white Jewish people do have a hard time fitting 100% into that category of whiteness. It's like, yeah, but we weren't the guys who were making up these categories and putting ourselves on the right side of it. So that's part of the ambiguity as well, I think.
Our listeners probably mostly will be, when they think about anti-Semitism, they'll be familiar with, Jews Don't Count by David Baddiel. That's the thing that most people will be familiar with. So he kind of argues, right, that Jews kind of are a minority that suffers prejudice, but either minorities sort of don't accept they don't count the kind of Jewish racism against Jews in the same way. To what extent do you agree with like his kind of analysis of this?
I think the thing about that analysis is that, especially in the UK, if you asked any other racialized minority, do you think that self-declared anti-racists have an understanding of the racism that's directed at you, they would answer with a resounding no. I think nobody counts in this political and media economy. I remember doing articles about anti-Black racism in the Labour Party or Islamophobia in the Labour Party, and it would always be the same. The commonalities of, people aren't taking us seriously. People are being factional about it. It's become politicized. It would be the same themes directed against each racialized minority. And I think that that's the bit that is the important takeaway from all this, is that we cannot battle these racisms in silos that were invented by racism. Right? And I think what's interesting when you look at the history of racism is that in the post-war period, you had a whole bunch of intellectuals from Aimé Césaire to Hannah Arendt to W.E.B. Du Bois, who had a very clear understanding of the interconnectedness of racism and the need to be interconnected in our approach to anti-racism. And somehow anti-Semitism became untethered from our understanding of racism and also from our fight against racism. And so I think the most important thing here is that we can't actually tackle these different racisms in different categories. Our fight has to be collective, tethered together with the understanding that it might not look the same, but what we are all dealing with is racism. And I really appreciate the way that the British writer Gary Young put it recently at a conference on anti-Semitism, actually, where he said, racism is a language with many dialects, right? It's a language that, we recognize the language, but the dialects are going to be different across different contexts and countries. And I think that's a really helpful way to help us understand, but also reconnect our struggle against different kinds of racism.
It would be really interesting to hear your reflections a bit on kind of the Corbyn years within Labour and kind of how Labour has navigated anti-Semitism since then. Can you describe a bit how it felt to you and on the kind of British left during those years?
It felt pretty horrible. And I think it was horrendous for a lot of British Jewish leftists who are part of the Labour Party or, saw that as their political home. And, that would have been the case also for a lot of Jewish people who supported Jeremy Corbyn and his left-wing program, right? For, redistributive wealth and all the rest of the things, a green economy, a different policy in the international sphere, the support for all of those things. And so for that category of people who supported his policies and then saw this flare up, I think it was particularly disturbing. And the book actually doesn't deal with this era that much because I'm more interested in the kind of themes that inform why this subject has become such a political battleground. And so there's a couple of themes that are pertinent to progressives. There's a couple of chapters on the far right and how they use both anti-Semitism and the fight against anti-Semitism. And there's a couple of chapters on Israel, on Palestine. So I don't actually focus so much on the Corbyn era, but I do think that that period and then the sort of oversteer and overcorrection that we saw with Keir Starmer, and the fact that it was so overtly, anti-Semitism was so overtly and clearly used to purge political opponents. And so just being stuck in the middle of these two leaders who are both treating the issue badly. This is why I write in the book, I ended up feeling like the Goldilocks of anti-Semitism, just stuck in the middle of that.
You mentioned before, you touched on Israel Palestine being obviously a big part of this story. So I just want to go back to that a little bit. Some of the biggest confusions and debates around anti-Semitism are around criticism of Israel anti-Semitism. So just kind of to take it to really the basics for our listeners, when is criticism of Israeli policy, when is it actually anti-Semitic and when isn't it anti-Semitic? And actually, why is there so much confusion about this in general,
It's a really good question. And with the sort of apocalyptic war, Israel's war on Gaza, we've seen in this last over a year, that whole thing of using claims of anti-Semitism going to overdrive, where anyone criticizing Israel's actions in Gaza has been tarred with anti-Semitism. So that could be the UN, it could be, a British singer, it could be people just going on stop the war, calling for a ceasefire marches, who straightforwardly just don't want to see this bombardment of a besieged Palestinian strip where disproportionately women and children are being slaughtered and up to 45,000 people are now dead. So the idea that all of those people can be called anti-Semitic is obviously a huge problem. People need to be able to advocate for Palestine, particularly Palestinian voices, without constantly being shut down and silenced with these claims. And when we look at the issue, we can see that pretty much from the mid-70s onwards, you could see that Israel recalibrated an understanding of anti-Semitism, whereby it wasn't about individuals or collectives of Jews in the diaspora. It was about criticizing the state of Israel that had become the representative of the collective Jew. And this idea, you can see, formulated as a strategy, became more and more prevalent amongst Israeli sort of government officials, but also, campaigners and academics, and also in the diaspora, amongst diaspora Jewish bodies. And so it just became more and more a forceful strain of thought, and really reached a peak from the 2000s onwards, whereby so many things that are straightforwardly criticism of Israeli policies, criticism of Israel being a serial violator of international law, or for a serial aggressor in the region, whether it's, numerous assaults on Gaza or several now assaults on Lebanon, in which thousands of people, mainly civilians, are being killed. All of that criticism was construed as anti-Semitism. And so obviously there's a need to push back on all that and allow people to criticize the state of Israel and advocate for Palestinians without that accusation. But we are very much now in a political and media environment where that accusation is so, there's a tsunami of its use, to the extent that actually I fear what's happened now is that people are less likely to understand what anti-Semitism is and less likely to take it seriously. Because, like I write in the book, if all your friends and everyone that you can see that is criticizing Israel, if all of those people get cast as anti-Semitic, if everyone looks like a nail, right? then you're going to criticize the hammer, essentially. You're going to say there's something wrong with that hammer. So that's my concern with that sort of overwhelming criticism of everything as being anti-Semitic. It's not just that it's shutting down free speech, but that it's diluting people's capacity to understand anti-Semitism and take it seriously.
It's something that your book draws out that's sort of happened not just over the past year, but in recent years, is that there's this kind of right wing, I guess, narrative that you've got kind of a West versus Islam. And in this past year, it's as if all the anti-Semitism sits on the side of kind of Muslim civilization or something. And everybody in the West is sort of all right. And that sort of maps onto the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in some ways, where kind of all the anti-Semitism is found on these Gaza marches, for example. And then, you know, it all maps onto this really simple binary. Do you think that's kind of, is that mainstream sort of beyond the right, do you think? Has that become kind of almost like a mainstream way of seeing these things? And that's why, partly also why people kind of are so confused about what anti-Semitism even is? Or is it very much a right-wing phenomenon?
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting question. And there's so much going on in that sphere. And a lot of it is confusing and contradictory. So I try and unpack this in a couple of chapters in the book. I think you're absolutely right that that's the way that Western countries, and it does map onto Israel-Palestine, portray this as a sort of civilizational battle with Jews and Christians on one side and Muslims on the other and Islam on the other. And it, clearly is straightforwardly historically illiterate. When you have countries like Germany and Holland proclaim that their anti-Semitism problem is coming from, Muslim minorities and migrants, that is quite the statement. It's quite a lot of gall for a country like, say, Germany to say that. But you can see what's happened, and this is particularly in the post-war period. Again, you had this whole construct of a Judeo-Christian heritage, which is it's not a real thing. It's not a real hyphen. It's a constructed category that takes the once other Jewish people who are, historically for hundreds of years considered the other in Europe, takes them and puts them on the sort of Christian Western side, and therefore casts out and others a different category, which is now Muslims and Islam, which exist outside of the category. And so I think that whole construct is fairly mainstream now. You see all kinds of politicians speak about it. It does speak to the way that far-right narratives very quickly gain traction amongst the centrists, if unchallenged. And you especially see that narrative when it comes to the way that the far right defines itself as supposed champions of Jewish people in the fight against anti-Semitism, when obviously sometimes they are overtly anti-Semitic themselves. The best example of this being, say, Hungary's Viktor Orban, who ran a nakedly, straightforwardly anti-Semitic campaign, election campaign against the Jewish billionaire philanthropist George Soros, but claims to care a lot about Jews and care a lot about fighting anti-Semitism. And it's straightforwardly just a way to rehabilitate themselves as political players, but also a mechanism by which they can mainline their main current project, which is hating Muslims and hating migrants, and claim to be, the defenders of Jewish people in the mix. So the whole thing is such an abhorrent construct, essentially championing one racialized minority and using that to pit them against another racialized minority. It doesn't help any of us, but it is, as you say, it really is gaining traction in our political and media conversation.
So, I mean, that Hungary example, I think, is really interesting. And obviously, this year has been a strong one for the political right in lots of different countries. Do you see similar actions to those of Orban being replicated in the UK, where obviously Reform got a relatively strong vote in the election, in the US as well? are they at a similar point in that kind of trajectory, and are the same kind of, is there a playbook that's being used by lots of political actors?
Yes, I think that the right wing, and increasingly we can see right wing parties across Europe, including the UK, become much more nativist and nationalistic in their politics, become more, veer off towards much more right wing spaces, have successfully identified anti-Semitism as a wedge issue, and are using it to advance their own political purposes, but also divide and isolate and confuse their opponents. And we see this happen again and again and again, on both sides of the Atlantic. You know, when the former Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, was describing the protests against what was happening in Gaza as hate marches, and was talking very much in those terms of, Jewish people needing to be protected. That narrative slides very quickly into assumptions about, from whom do they need to be protected? And I can tell you, it's never the far right in that dialogue, even though most of the political and on the streets violence against Jewish people has actually come from the far right. So that whole construction, I do think it has increasing currency. It was very quickly deployed when we saw the violence in Amsterdam following a match with the home team and Maccabi Tel Aviv, who have a history of racism and hooliganism, and played this out on the streets of Amsterdam. And the violence that emerged where there was anti-Semitism, to be sure, but the violence that emerged was very, very quickly deployed by a far-right-led government into this sort of civilizational clash, battle, falsely, erroneously, hysterically, and then used to bash the sort of the local Muslim community, who are mostly from Morocco. So you can see that narrative emerge again and again and again. And I think it will keep doing that with the far right resurgence, both across Europe and in the US.
There are two kind of examples of mass like online confusion and sort of backlash that you highlight in the book around comments by Whoopi Goldberg about anti-Semitism and racism, and Diane Abbott, the Hackney MP, when her letter was published in The Guardian, also about anti-Semitism and racism. And of course, like part of the kind of, I don't know, background to the story you're telling, certainly in recent years, is social media and the fact that like we can't talk to each other and all we can do is shout at each other. And that exact Amsterdam example is such a perfect example of that too. But do you, having written this book and talked to all these people, do you have any sort of kind of a note of optimism to give us that there will be a point where the people will manage to have an actual kind of good, civilized, constructive conversation about this? Or does it feel like, there's no hope for that at all?
That's such a great question. I do see lots of reason to be hopeful. I think a lot of people are really fed up with the conversation that we're having about anti-Semitism, and confused by it. I mean, it's basically just become a bun fight between different political camps. And the end result has been less understanding. People have less understanding of anti-Semitism than they did before we started talking about it in this horrendous, polarizing, hectoring, screaming way. And I do meet them as well. And I've spoken to so many of them when I was researching this book, and I'm meeting them now at book events. So many people who genuinely just want to find a better way of talking about this. They can see the ravaging impact that the way we're talking about it is having about all of the things that they care about, including, Jewish minorities, their Jewish comrades, in various progressive organizations, including other racialized minorities, Black people, Muslim people in the UK, including the way we talk about Israel-Palestine, including the rise of the far right and the way they get to wield this racism in their horrendous battle. A lot of people are really disturbed by that and wanna talk about it in a much better way and want to talk about it with each other in a much better and more constructive way. So absolutely, I do feel, yeah, we see a lot of horrendous screaming, screeching, as you say, on social media. But I do feel very lucky that, researching and now talking about this book has put me in contact with a lot of people who I want to hope are a silent majority, who genuinely want to have a better conversation about this and genuinely want to retether anti-Semitism to the struggle against all racism so that we can build inclusion, but so that also we can build a wider and stronger and more forceful political progressive movement.
Rachel, just before we go, so your book is obviously a really interesting text for people to read if they're looking to kind of clear up some of this confusion that we've talked about today around anti-Semitism. But I wonder if there are also other people's work, other sources, other books that you might recommend to our listeners to go and look at as well.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so many people and so many organizations in this sphere. I can give you a few that spring to mind immediately. So the Birkbeck Institute for the Study of Antisemitism not only has exceptional academics writing and thinking and speaking in this field. So there's quite a few reports you can go and find straight away from that institute, but they also ongoingly have conferences and they run a webinar series. They are very much concerned with not just understanding anti-Semitism and how it shows up in a contemporary context, but also reconnecting it to our understanding of other forms of racism. And so they constantly are bringing on people in panels or in webinars to talk about the interconnectedness angle, which I think a lot of people will find fascinating, especially, thoughtful prospect readers and listeners. And the other one is Diaspora Alliance, which is relatively, it's been around for a few years now. It's an organization that aims to confront both the instrumentalized way in which anti-Semitism is used, so the claims that are used to shut down Palestine advocacy, and also at the same time fight anti-Semitism. So trying to do the two together. And so they're currently doing that work across the US and the UK and Germany. And they also run several, sort of conferences and put out very clarifying papers and briefings about the subject. So I'd recommend that as well.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Thank you for joining us. You can read Rachel's book. Of course, you can also read her piece for Prospect from June, I think it was, on our website. It's an excellent piece about how the Gaza war has fractured Britain's Jewish minority. Thank you so much for joining us, Rachel.
Thank you for having me on.